This morning's scripture reading is from Micah chapter 3, first 4 verses. And I said, "Hear, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like a flesh in a cauldron. Then they will cry to the Lord, but he will not answer them. He will hide his face from them at that time, because they have made their deeds evil." Today's message is from Reverend John Chamberlain, Micah, God's Advocates for the Powerless. We don't need his introduction.
Well, good morning. It's good to be in worship with all of you. Thank all of you for being here, and I'm thankful for all the good work you do for Christ and the church. The book of Micah is barely touched upon in our 3-year church lectionary cycle, although it's very accessible because it's only 7 short verses. Micah is my favorite biblical prophet. He was actively prophesying around the year 725 to 701 BCE, before the Common Era. He was a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. So Micah's been around for a while, but I think that he still has much to say to us today. Let's listen again to the beginning of chapter 3. Micah is speaking a word of judgment on God's behalf for the poor and the oppressed. And this biting word of judgment is delivered not to the nation at large, as most of us were taught in the 1960s, but rather specifically to the ruling elite in society. Micah says, "Hear this, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel." He's talking to the ruling elite. "Is it not for you to know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in the cauldron." Kind of gets your attention, doesn't it? The image here is obviously one of cannibalism. And while it may not be literally true, the reality being described is just as real. Propelled by their unrestrained greed, the rich and powerful are getting fat at the expense of the poor majority in society whom they are devouring. The fact that this could be done at a distance through unjust social structures allows their consciences to rest easy, although it certainly doesn't alter the reality. Micah is outraged by this. To those who hold the power of social and economic coercion, he holds up a mirror so that they're forced to see themselves the way they really are. I want to emphasize it again that this oracle is not directed to Israelites in general, which is the way it's usually interpreted. It's directed specifically to the ruling elite. To really grasp the implications of this, it's important to know a little bit about ancient pre-industrial agrarian society. It was very hierarchical, highly stratified and inequitable. The ruling elite, basically the king and governing officers, made up only 1 or 2% of the population, yet they controlled half or more of the total goods and services in society. In ancient agrarian society, there was a very small middle class compared to our own modern American society. We have a relatively large middle class. But in ancient agrarian society, the middle class was very small, maybe 3 or 5%. And then at the bottom of the social order, we had predominantly peasants, people who lived close to a bare subsistence existence. And they made up more than 90% of the population, these people at the bottom. It was this extreme inequality of wealth and power that enabled the numerically small ruling elite to exploit the poor and powerless majority. Ancient agrarian society was very different from our own. You see, the ruling urban owners of large estates didn't farm the land themselves. The peasants did that. And these peasants were living a mere hand-to-mouth kind of existence. Because peasants had to give a large portion of their produce to the king and officers of the monarchy in the form of taxes. When their crops failed, which happened periodically due to drought and pest infestation and other natural catastrophes, as well as war. But when their crops failed, this left them very vulnerable to debt because they had to go to the ruling elite to get loans. The ruling elite controlled all the surplus. And all they had to put up for collateral on their loans was either their land and or the indentured labor of one or more of their family members. So the ruling elite could take advantage of this by foreclosing on the peasants. And eventually, this resulted in peasant farmers losing their land completely, so that they had to become day laborers or debt slaves themselves. Often humiliatingly on land that they previously had owned. But this whole process reduced them to yet another level of poverty. This dynamic of aggressive land consolidation is what we see reflected in the oracles of the 8th century biblical prophets. The privileged few are grabbing more and more land at peasant expense, even though peasants bore the burden of supporting the elite's lavish lifestyle. This is clearly to be seen in the book of Micah. If we go back to Micah chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we read, "Woe to those who devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. At the morning light they carry it out, because it is within their power. They covet fields and rip them off, and houses and seize them. They oppress by extortion a fellow and his house, people and their ancestral inheritance." He's talking about the land here. Prophet Isaiah said much the same thing. As one example, he says, "Woe to you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no room for anyone but you." This is what's going on. The ruling elite were taking control of land and house that were the ancestral inheritance of peasant households. This meant that they were robbed of their access to the economic base in this agrarian society. And this is what the 8th century prophets were railing against. That's the concrete context of the prophets prophesying. Furthermore, since the wealthy were aided and abetted in their exploitation and self-delusion by the religious establishment, a word of judgment is directed at them as well. Going on in chapter 3, verse 5. Micah says, "Thus says the Lord concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against those who put nothing in their mouths." What's being portrayed here are clergy who have a wet finger to the wind, so to speak. I can still see my Old Testament mentor, Marvin Cheney, doing this in class. That was a big gesture. Ministers with unfailing accuracy are able to discern which way the wind is going and preach accordingly. By aligning their self-interests with those of the governing class, these high-priced pastors are placing a religious blessing on crime. They're providing a sacred legitimation for inequitable arrangements of power. And with these bought and paid for clergy people, we're assured that God is not well pleased. Micah goes on, "Therefore, it shall be night to you without vision, and darkness to you without divination. The sun shall go down upon the prophets, and the day shall be black over them. The seers shall be disgraced, the diviners put to shame. They shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer from God." Then Micah says, But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his crime, and to Israel his sin." want you to notice here that the infilling spirit and the call to do justice come together. The spirit isn't just a private possession given to certain individuals so that they can feel spiritually superior to others, nor is it some sort of cosmic fire insurance. God's spirit compels people to do justice. Doing justice is integral for our being in faithful relationship with God. Micah continues his indictment against the rulers, priests, and false prophets of the nation in a summary oracle at the end of chapter 3. Here he says, "Hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its heads give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach for hire. Its prophets divine for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord in the midst of us? No evil shall come upon us." The governing elite in society were religious. That's not the problem. They were pious and devout. They were convinced that God is on their side and can be unconditionally relied upon to promote their well-being and security. Theirs is an assured, confident faith, one that boasts, is not the Lord in our midst? Surely disaster will not come upon us. Such strong faith would certainly be admirable were it not so diluted. Micah abruptly shatters the misplaced expectations of his audience by announcing the punishment. He says, "Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountains of the house a wooded height." Micah is saying that the political and religious capital of the nation, the center of everything they hold dear, is going to be reduced to rubble. In other words, the ruling elite that oppress the poor will get what they deserve. I'm thinking this passage isn't read very often at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. Anyway, Micah speaks on God's behalf for those who are weak and most vulnerable in society. He takes their side over and against the high and mighty. God's side with the downtrodden victims of current arrangements of power. God doesn't endorse the prevailing unjust socio-economic order. Widespread poverty in the midst of affluence deeply offends God's love and compassion. So Micah bends over backwards to insist that it's impossible to have a right relationship with God without having an unequivocal commitment to justice. About this, the prophet is adamant. Then, suddenly, in chapter 4, a better world is imagined. What is perverted in chapter 3 is made right and restored to what God intends for it to be in chapter 4. Here in this utopian vision, Yahweh alone is king. Only God is king. And under God's sovereign rule, an entirely different order ensues. God will judge between many peoples and decide who's in the right for numerous distant nations. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up no sword against nation, nor shall they train for war anymore, but they shall sit, everyone under his own vine and under his fig tree, with none to terrify, for the mouth of Yahweh of hosts has spoken. Depicted here is a peasant utopia, an environment free from domination and exploitation, an environment in which people will be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, safe from the threats of war-making states. In God's kingdom, disputes between nations will not be resolved by recourse to military force. In this truly new world order, love of mammon and devotion to Mars will no longer govern the action of nations. Instead, with their economic affairs ruled by God's authority, weapons will be converted into implements of agriculture, and the resources of society will be used to meet the needs of the majority of its citizens. These passages from Micah dramatically illustrate the age-old competition between war-making and basic human needs. After all, war is the eating of people in more ways than one. What Micah wants us to see is the relationship between a nation's militarism and domestic justice. Common people have always borne the burden of taxation that pays for the militarization of society. In Micah's day, agricultural surplus was extracted from the peasants in order to finance imperial wars. And this imposed a grave hardship on the present peasant majority. And of course, I think the same is true for us today. Resources that ought rightly to be used in service to life are too often being mobilized in service to death. You can't help but think of President Dwight David Eisenhower's famous warning shortly before he left office. He said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signals in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." This old guns versus butter issue has been with us a long, long time. Micah's testimony is that in God's scheme of things, butter, socioeconomic justice, and concern for the poor and powerless are to take precedence over guns, exploitation, and the privileges of an elite few. My Old Testament mentor, Marvin Cheney, who also happened to be my favorite professor at SFTS, but he used to point out here that while chapter 4 of Micah might be called an unrealistic dream, that herein is precisely where its usefulness lies, where it holds out to us an alternative vision of what society could and should be. Here we're confronted with the possibility of a new and truly different future, even as current social arrangements are judged and found wanting. We're called to work for nothing less than the coming of God's kingdom, a reign that resists confusion with the ravenous foreign and domestic policies of Caesar. And this call can't be merely dismissed as politics, as we too often hear. This call is an integral part of our faith. In Micah's summary oracle, which is found in chapter 6, verse 8, the prophet declares, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, God has shown you, O human, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Nothing but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. This is what true worship consists of. Doing justice, showing compassion, a commitment that cares for others, and humbly going along with God. On the other hand, worship that's offered in lieu of working to create a more just social order, God finds offensive. Religion that never gets out of the church sanctuary is wholly unacceptable to the Lord. I'm going to quit about there, but I'm going to mention one more thing. After hearing all this talk about justice, some of you are probably thinking, well, okay, but isn't God concerned about individuals? Doesn't God care about individuals? I'm going to quote theologian Marcus Borg here because I think he answers this question extremely well. He says, we should think of concern for the individual and concern for a just society, not as an either or choice, but as a both and. The prophetic voices of the tradition show a deep awareness of how individuals are victimized by society. Passion for the well-being of individuals and passion about the shape of the community go hand in hand. Because individuals matter to God, political structures matter to God. For political structures impact the lives of individuals to an exceptional degree. Thus, the dream of God combines an emphasis on the value of the individual with a passionate concern for a just society. That's the message of Micah.